Yeah. Yeah.
Whoa.
I said,
Hey man, we back at it like a good snack habit. Hey,
What's going on?
yo,
What we
you know,
got?
Seaboy and Snack, we're back at it. Seaboy and Snack.
What we
we're
got?
back at
Who
it.
we doing? Where you is? What you ruin?
I want to see what y'all think about this, man, because I be getting so many comments in the comment section about you didn't know that, or y'all should have known that, or yes, this happened, or why does it matter? We get so many different very random opinions in there, but this is the horrible life of an average Roman Empire slave. And of course we didn't know this, didn't know nothing about it. We just saw this video. So boom, you can just forget your comment and just look at the video and not even say nothing. So let's get it.
Okay. Well, all right then. Because you're the comment reader.
I'm
God bless
now,
you.
and don't got, I love y'all commenting. You know I love y'all. But I'm talking about them idiots out there
Yes.
because I be looking at all the comments.
Made possible by Wix. If you're ready to create a website, head on over to wix.com/go/infographics2019 to try out one of their premium plans right now. Slaves in ancient Rome weren't all laborers working hard under the hot sun, as some wicked slave driver stood behind them with a whip in his hand. Many of the slaves were domestic servants, some were skilled artisans, others were even said to be highly educated physicians. The ones who did generally have a very hard life were those that were doing their time as property of a Roman as a punishment. Life for these people was brutal and often very short. For that reason, there were sometimes slave revolts, with the one you all probably know about led by the slave Spartacus. This former gladiator and military leader took part in what are now called the Servile Wars. But what about the average Joe slaves? So, as Roman slaves lived such diverse lives, let's start with the great Spartacus. The Greek writer Plutarch tells us that Spartacus was a Thracian by birth, who had once served as a soldier with the Romans, but had since been a prisoner and sold for a gladiator. If he indeed was Thracian, then that would mean he came from what we now call Bulgaria, or possibly Greece or Turkey. While sources differ, it's said that Spartacus was first captured by Roman legions, and then trained in gladiatorial school.
Whoa.
If you've seen our show on what sometimes went down in the Roman Colosseum, you'll know that gladiators didn't exactly have an easy life. What do we know about the school?
All I know is them armpits need to be shaved. Them thick right there, boy. His armpits are like his beard.
Wow.
Well, these prisoners of war were kept often two to a cell. They were in fact in prison, but each day they would train outside of their cells in an arena. Gladiators had different kinds of skills and training methods, and Thracian gladiators practiced in the art of swordsmanship. National Geographic tells us that the slaves were not allowed out of the fortress unless being taken to the Colosseum or another arena. But while the cells were not exactly a great place to live, it's said that there were heated floors for winter, baths, and an infirmary, and the slaves lived in confines that were equipped with plumbing. Historians say these gladiators were highly valued slaves, and so they were kept in good condition so they could fight well. These slaves, we were told, usually would not die or even be treated too badly in their prison. They occupied a 32 square foot cell, which, as we said, was probably shared with one more person. They trained day in and day out all year round, and trained not as a team but as individuals. When the time came, they were often taken out of the training school and sent to fight in an arena somewhere. So the life of a gladiator slave? Probably a much better existence than hard labor, but obviously they could find themselves in a very bad place being pitted against a starving lion. That's likely one of the reasons why Spartacus decided to plot against the Romans and head for the hills. It's believed he was captured and killed, with many of his followers also dying by way of crucifixion. But perhaps a fate worse than being trained to fight in an arena.
What people don't know is, you thought that when Christ was crucified, that's the first time that happened. That was how they were when they were crucified people. They had done that many times in the Roman tradition. When they put people out there on the cross like that.
Mm-hmm.
Did you know that?
Yeah.
Arena was hard labor. After all, someone had to build those great cities in the ancient empire, mine the precious metals, and plow the fields. We're told quite often these people would literally be worked to death. When these people were captured, often by Roman soldiers, they were often taken to the market where they were sold. Anyone could buy himself or herself a slave, and it's said some more wealthy people might own as many as 400 slaves. Perhaps the worst kind of work was in the Roman mines, although historians also say that slave farmers had a very hard job. Women slaves with less muscle might work in the house as servants, but they might also be given the job of dressmaking or even hairdresser. Many other women were sent to work in small factories where they would make handcrafts and jewelry. The young boys, it's said, were expensive, as it's not likely many Romans wanted old men in their employ. We say employ, but they weren't paid anything. They had to do exactly as they were told, and any kind of backchat could lead to a serious beating. If a slave killed his own master, that would usually end in all the slaves of the household being killed. One might have a nice master, but the opposite was of course possible. As we said before, some slaves gained a certain amount of respect as they were educated. These slaves would often be appointed to the work of teacher for the young Romans. As one writer tells us, how a slave was treated depended on the owner. If a slave was favored by his owner, there was always a chance that this slave could earn his freedom, perhaps the best thing that could happen to a Roman slave. On the other hand, get an awful owner and there was every chance you could be beaten, flogged, branded, maimed, or killed. One historian writes about the slaves of Pompeii, stating that the average household in the city would have around 7 slaves. He wrote that the work of slaves could be tough, but they were often free to roam about the streets, grab a bit of rest down at the fountain, or just disappear in the crowd. The richer Romans didn't usually walk through the crowded streets, as that would be beneath them. Instead, when they went out, they were carried by slaves on what
them jokers would jump on the back of people. They'd say, "Here, carry me off. Walk me down to the market." No, when you that rich, you don't go to the market, man. You eating grapes and right there in your place.
Getting your food delivered.
Right. So it still looks like it was treated. It looks like it was treated a lot more fairly in this situation, unless you just had a bad slave owner. That's the gist of it.
Right.
But must have been how Roman slaves, because according to the Indian and the transatlantic, I don't know what this one fall under, but they were treated badly. So this was treated like
says some of these slaves were also treated pretty bad.
Yeah, it must be. It depends on just who. It just depends on your slave master.
Called a litter. They are those boxes on sticks you may have seen in the movies. What's surprising though, according to this historian anyway, is that the slaves were not always identifiable by the clothes they wore. They often wore tunics just like anyone else. Apparently not so many slave owners would wear togas, as they were too cumbersome and not always easy to clean. As for cleaning, we're told that clothes would often be washed partly with urine. The reason was that it contained lots of ammonia. One of the jobs of a slave, of course, was washing these clothes, so part of their day would be standing in baths of urine. This was likely not the most pleasant job in the world, but laundry detergent was a long way from being invented. As these slaves were property, if they were damaged in some way, say hit by someone's donkey on their way to cleaning duties, the owner of that donkey would have to pay for the treatment of the slave, or at least pay some money to the slave's owner. Here, we must remember that around 1 out of 5 people across the Roman Empire were slaves at one point, and there was no great feeling of injustice, at least to the Romans. Having slaves was as normal as having people that work for low wages in current-day factories or coffee shops. For the rulers of Rome, the inequality was just part of life. We might also remember that those great Greek philosophers who, for the most part, were noble and extremely clever, said that a perfect society had to have slaves. That's just how it was, and it's likely that Plato or Aristotle just couldn't see it any differently. Remember, in the Roman Empire, the slaves were often the losers of a battle, or at least the surviving citizens of a losing army. The Romans just saw it as their right to take them, but slaves often came by way of piracy or just plain stealing. Gangs of people would go into a town and just take people there.
It all still just goes back to information that's regurgitated. That's the truth. That they did this over here, they did this over here. The pirates got them over there.
Because I was wondering, like, okay, who are these? How do they become Roman slaves? And I don't see any black slaves. So these slaves obviously aren't African American or aren't African or from African descent. But what are their descent? Are they pure Roman, or have they, come from other places,
Italian,
brought to Rome?
Good question. Good question.
Then deliver them by boats or over land to the markets where the Romans would buy them. If those slaves had children with a Roman, those children would also be slaves. One historian tells us that slaves were not allowed to have their own slave families. Life was work, and that was it. The more slaves a Roman had was part of his status. And if you had very special slaves being able to do special things, then that also added to your status. When in public, Roman would often come out with their slaves, showing them off to other Romans. These days, people use things like cars, clothes, bling to do the same thing. And that's what we have to remember, that slaves were seen as mere things, albeit things that could talk. But again, some slaves, the very special ones, did teach things such as philosophy. So we would imagine those slaves had a higher value than someone who spent all day down in a mine digging for gold. We very much doubt that they spent all day chained, like some of the slaves that were found after Mount Vesuvius erupted in Pompeii. Researchers also said that some of those slaves had been working so much that their bodies were all out of shape. As we said, the best thing that could happen to you is that you could win your freedom, and this did happen. Some Romans used it to make slaves work harder, telling them obedience could pay off. Some historians also tell us that in spite of the occasional slave revolts, it was in the interest of slave owners to treat their slaves well, and so...
See, that's tough because in the back of somebody's head, they're working, if I work 10 times harder, then they'll let me free, when actually they're using that like almost like if this is one of those places saying going out of business sale, you ain't going out of business. If I use that, then I can get production can change drastically.
Mm-hmm.
If you lie to this person and say,
that's
you get what I'm saying?
up. Yeah.
He did. A well-fed slave worked harder and was happier, and would likely not dream all day about sinking a knife into his or her owner. We'll leave you with the words of one writer. No doubt some slave owners were more generous than others, and there was, in a few cases, the possibility of earning one's freedom, but the harsh day-to-day reality of the vast majority of Roman slaves was certainly an unenviable one.
But is that the end?
Yeah, because he's just going through a lot of explaining on Wix. I can tell by when I scroll forward, it's not about that
Oh,
anymore.
yeah, look at the end.
Look, yeah, no, Wix.
Is
Wix.
that Wix right there?
Wix,
I can't
the
tell.
website stuff.
Wow.
Wow.
So the Roman slaves were people that they captured, and I mean people that were were of war, prisoners of war, pretty much.
Right.
And people like pirates and stuff brought over
Yep.
and sold.
Eyes work hard for you, ball.
Because that's what I was wondering. Like, where did they get these slaves? Are they slaves from their own country?
Good question. And pirates, if it comes from a pirate standpoint, there's no telling where it came from a pirate standpoint. So I don't know.
But it seems like they weren't treated as harsh as some of the other slaves that we listened, some of the videos that we listened to. Yeah.
No castration, no chattel creation. No.
But they still were treated harshly. It said, they still were mistreated.
They sound like that's how I know it sounds Roman, because it matches up to, I keep saying it, not saying I'm, trying to holy roll over here, but it just matched up to what the word says when you look back at when it talked about, when you see people locked up in the cells and being treated this way. So think about something like, maybe think about from a level of Peter being locked up, and that's how I vision, that's how it was like that versus chattel.
But they were made to fight, and then they were made to train and work under those horrible conditions.
Right.
It's like, I just don't like that, to hear them talk about how they mistreated people. I just don't like
that. That was terrible
care
things, but
where they came from around the globe is still mistreatment.
Yeah.
But yeah. But out of everything, based off of this depiction, it looked like, it wasn't as bad as some of it. And maybe because it was animated. I don't know.
Right. The animation softens it up.
Yeah.
The animation softens it up a lot. So, all right. Like, comment, subscribe. Don't take a nosedive, but comment down in the section below if you want some more of this kind of stuff.
So, we need to do more about the Roman slaves, because I don't think we've heard of it. And when I was thinking about the gladiators, it's like, oh, okay, so that really was for real, and they really had to do that, like the movie. Bye, guys. See you in the next video.